Hi, my name is James Miller. I'm currently a PhD student in the Department of Architecture at the University of Oregon. Thank you for attending this lecture. The purpose of this study is to draw attention to the role of endogenous systems in the promotion of grassroots development in post-disaster Haiti. The study is explored through the lens of post-disaster recovery following the devastating earthquake that took place in 2010. Haiti is infamously known as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere and is located in the Caribbean, sharing the western third of the island of Hispaniola with the Dominican Republic. What took place on January 12, 2010, in many ways added insult to injury. To give a brief history of Haiti, Christopher Columbus landed in the northern part of Haiti, near Cap Haitian. The island was colonized, the indigenous population was massacred, and slaves were brought in from Africa to work the plantations. In 1791, slaves began to revolt, and in 1804, they declared independence, and a new nation was born, which would not gain acceptance in the eyes of the Western world until it paid an indemnity to France, and would still not be accepted by the United States until the abolition of slavery. The Haitian people have proven resilient through the tests of time. Of January 12, 2010, an earthquake devastated Haiti, affecting 3 million people, killing more than 300,000 and destroying nearly 80,000 buildings in Port-au-Prince alone. The city of Lakou, the epicenter of the quake, was flattened, with the exception of a few buildings. In days, non-governmental organizations, multinational aid organizations, and foreign governments responded with supplies, food, physicians, and other necessary aid items such as shelter. Following post-disaster protocol, medical and food aid were attended to first, and then materials for temporary shelters, such as tarps, ropes, and survival kits, were distributed. These three responses correspond to human rights defined by the UN, following post-disaster protocol. Post-disaster housing reconstruction and resettlement follows a linear trajectory from emergency shelter to permanent shelter. Shelter is a necessity. In fact, it is considered a human right. But how can it be allocated properly? Temporary settlements are often failures. Out of the necessity of top-down implementation of post-disaster planning, more often than not, leads to the failure of these settlements and the creation of further vulnerability. We need to turn the triangle upside down and work from the bottom up, not from the top down. Examples from past disasters show the creation of adverse socioeconomic, psychological, and cultural effects, as well as the creation of ghost towns. Change needs to be made within PDR policy, that's post-disaster redevelopment policy. I argue that this top-down process is not effective in promoting sustainable redevelopment, more often than not leaving people out of the equation. Planners put more faith in logistics than they do in the endogenous and indigenous communities themselves. Furthermore, vulnerable populations need methods to develop resilience. It has been demonstrated that solidarity and moral obligations have been effective. Changing the culture of building in these populations can also create resilience through the development of more secure structures and planning. Post-disaster planning and reconstruction needs to happen at a local level to ensure the inclusion of all people involved and in order to be socially and culturally responsible. In order to address vulnerability and create resilience, the individual needs to be empowered. So how was post-disaster reconstruction implemented following the earthquake in Haiti? Soon, organizations began planning for post-disaster internally displaced persons, IDP camps, and resettlement plans. As a large number fled the capital, migrating toward the northern, southern, and far western ends of Haiti, namely Lakou, Jacmel, and Cap Haitian. So these circles represent the concentration of migration populations. The nation's mobile provider, Digicel, was actually what made it possible to track the migration so quickly and accurately. Here we see the types of spontaneous and emergency settlements that took place following the earthquake. So here is one of the spontaneous settlements that took place as people fled the built environment and the concrete rubble to form tent camps in open fields in the perimeter of Port-au-Prince. Here you see the use of the materials given to them by aid organizations, as well as materials they've purchased from local merchants, and as well as those acquired from bartering and trading within the communities. Here's an emergency shelter as part of a settlement near the airport in Port-au-Prince, one of the larger spontaneous self-settled post-disaster settlements in Haiti. And this still existed 2 years following the earthquake. And here you have an aerial view just demonstrating the size of it. It's approximately 30,000 families that were living in this in 2012 when I was in Haiti. So why was the damage so severe? Underdevelopment in Haiti is systemic. The population of Haiti is likely over 10 million, and the population density of Port-au-Prince was 1,500 persons per hectare. Today it is most likely even higher, around 2,000 persons per hectare. That is roughly 1 person per 8 square feet, or 1 person per a little less than 1 square meter. Haiti suffers greatly from over-urbanization and the effects of overpopulation. The increased consumption, inequitable distribution of wealth, and poor management of resources all led to environmental degradation of the country. Haiti is known for the awful effects of deforestation and soil erosion. These problems were further exacerbated by foreign aid dependency, a population boom, and a predatory state. So if you look at the images to the left and top center, you see the disparities between the border of the Dominican Republic and Haiti, showing the clear disparities of Haiti and the massive problems of soil erosion. People fear that these new massive informal settlements that have cropped up since the earthquake will become worse than St. Martin was and how Carrefour is today. So this slide is of St. Martin, which was one of the largest slums in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, which was eradicated through an urban renewal program and restored with social housing, which was also a failure, but that's another story. Is Carrefour, which is the largest slum in Port-au-Prince, though technically it's been upgraded from slum status, but still one of the largest informal settlements within Port-au-Prince. It's become more apparent that the nature of these settlements is threatening the health and safety of those living in them. Epidemics of cholera, poor sanitation, and the lack of clean water persist, and there is a constant threat of crime and other gang-related activity. Furthermore, these temporary settlements were not built to resist hurricanes, which frequent the area and leave room for more potentially devastating disasters, creating a perpetual cycle of calamity. Today, 279,000 people are still displaced, and 352 IDP camps still exist across the country. There has been significant decreases in these, an 82% decrease of displaced persons and a 77% reduction in IDP camps. But massive shifts in urban populations have taken place due to the migration following the earthquake. So in this image, we see Karai, one of the largest new settlements that has cropped up since the earthquake, potentially to be one of the largest slums in all of Haiti. The issues that surround the temporary settlements bring up many questions regarding the implementation strategies and development and design processes of installing emergency, transitional, and permanent post-disaster settlements. At the forefront of post-disaster planning should be the social, cultural, and ethical responsibilities of aiding in the transformation of the current temporary settlements into viable, permanent ones. Herein lies the gap in current practice, the need for allowing bottom-up mechanisms to take place, and also showing the problems between going from temporary to permanent settlements and what that means. So what will better enhance development in the case of Haiti? Look to the people to rebuild their nation, just as they broke free from the bonds of slavery. This study provides a lens to look at the broad implications of not only post-disaster development policies, but also how we look at informal and spontaneous settlements in the larger urban context, uncovering bottom-up mechanisms of development. Spontaneous settlements, such as the self-settled post-disaster settlements, allow flexibility and allow for social systems to emerge in the built environment. If I look at living traditions, the focus of this research is on the resilient traditional settlement pattern known as the Lakou, to see what its implications in post-disaster redevelopment are and how to create resilience. Deeply rooted in the Haitian culture is the strength to overcome adversity. The Lakou system has been resilient throughout the turbulent history of Haiti. It has allowed the peasantry a level of autonomy while tyrants ruled the country, and provided them a means of agricultural economy and sustenance farming. Although the Lakou system does not hold the prominence it once had, in today's urbanized landscape, the Lakou still remains important, albeit transformed. So what is the Lakou? The Lakou is a traditional settlement pattern of Haiti. The Lakou defines an extended family and the cluster of houses, compound, or courtyard that they occupy. It manifests in physical space and as a social construct. The Lakou has a met, or chief, that is usually the eldest person in the family. Although the land is divided equally among each subsequent generation, typically the family makes agreements for land allocation and zoning for construction. Two other aspects of the Lakou are the convent and the Sang. The convent is an agricultural cooperative which uses a ceremonial procession to recruit neighbors to help with planting and the harvest, rewarded by a feast at the end. The Sang is rolling access to credit, established within the Lakou. As part of the field research, I visited during the Rara festivities at Souvenance Lakou, outside of Gonaïves, which is one of the oldest and largest Lakous in Haiti. As you can see in this site plan, it is showing Souvenance Lakou, and you can see the clustering of the houses and concentration of them in one area, allowing for maximization of the agricultural fields. And then the courtyards designated by the shaded areas, which are the social cores where life happens in the Lakou. Festivities are part of a spring planting festival connected with voodoo religion and the tradition of the convent. The Rara festivities and voodoo rituals draw the members of the Lakou back to their land from the city and demonstrate the role of tradition and cultural continuity in Haiti. These festivities even bring back members of the Lakou living abroad in the US and Europe, who are part of the diasporic Lakou. So here, this Lakou consists of over 60 families living within it, all related to each other, part of the extended family. Aspects of the Rara representing the traditional notion of conflict. So the most notable development of the Lakou took place at the end of the 19th century, as the government divided its land into parts and distributed land to those who were willing to grow cash crops, such as coffee, sugarcane, and indigo. In this period, the people developed social and cultural customs tied to the land, such as the convent and the Sang, as we just saw. And the Lakou system was born to take place as a predominant settlement pattern in Haiti. Furthermore, the development took place in a time of unstable governments. Forming an absence of the government, it acted as an auto-regulatory system, providing autonomy and individual freedom for inhabitants. Typologies of the Lakou were uncovered through the literature. The first is the simple clustering of family homes with agricultural land surrounding. The second is a clustering of family homes within a boundary, such as a wall or a fence. The third is a single home surrounded by a wall with an extended family dividing the house amongst them, from the pressures of urbanization and high density. And the fourth typology is the private Lakou of the nuclear family, which is more prevalent in the urban settings such as Port-au-Prince. Here is where the Lakou becomes the literal translation of yard or courtyard. It is argued that the traditional Lakou system disappears in the urban environment, but I disagree. So the hypothesis of this study is that the Lakou manifests itself in post-disaster Haitian settlements. Through their own devices, endogenous inhabitants create the Lakou in post-disaster settlements, and therefore the Lakou may play a role in post-disaster resilience. Into the field and conducted qualitative analysis of spontaneous self-settled post-disaster settlements in Haiti for a period of 2 months in the spring of 2012, so 2 years following the earthquake. Spontaneous settlements were chosen because they allowed for social processes to emerge within the built environment. I observed 4 self-settled post-disaster settlements, noting social interactions through behavior maps and notes, and documenting each side through measured drawings. And I interviewed roughly 50 individuals to understand the conditions in the camps, with a focus on social life. The interviews were conducted with the inhabitants of each settlement through the aid of an interpreter. The goal of the interviews was to transmit meaning to social interactions and how the inhabitants define the social form of the Lakou in space. The interview also helps to illustrate the community defined by the Lakou. The interpreters provided a key asset, which was gaining access to these camps. The sites selected were in Port-au-Prince and Léogâne. Although Lakous have not been prevalent in Port-au-Prince, it was useful to study these post-disaster settlements to understand the transformations of the Lakou in the urban setting and to see if it manifested in very high density post-disaster camps. Laogan was selected because the Lakou has been the prominent settlement pattern in the region, and there was a good chance that the Lakou would be brought into the post-disaster camps by the inhabitants. I chose to study self-settled post-disaster camps because they are created by the inhabitants, without the aid of external planners or aid organizations. Through looking at informal camps, the study could uncover the incremental and generative patterns that are developed by the human processes of inhabitants. Planned post-disaster settlements conform to rigid standards and most likely would not have allowed for the development of the Lakou system within these constraints. So in Laogan, as we see here, the site to the north is called Kapiti, a semi-permanent site, and to the south is Sugar Canyon, a spontaneous, self-settled post-disaster settlement. Port-au-Prince, I chose Save the Children, an emergency/temporary settlement that was in the area of Delma 73. And nearby, the walled settlement, a spontaneous post-disaster settlement that formed within inside of a wall. So these settlements in Port-au-Prince are kind of close to the airport, just northeast of the downtown corridor. And another interesting thing that was found through these interviews was the changing of people's concepts of the Lakou and how varying they were, which added complexity to the study. There were various understandings of the Lakou, from the literal translation of a yard or a courtyard to the voodoo spirituality. These perceptions prove the transforming definition of the Lakou. Furthermore, the mass internal migrations that took place left urban dwellers living next door from a rural dweller, both of whom held varying understandings of the Lakou, and this happened in both Port-au-Prince and Laogan. The following are the major findings. The Lakou is present in post-disaster settlements, albeit transformed. It has become inclusive of the greater community, including non-familial members. The Lakou is a resilience factor. It is a social safety net, and the social patterns of the Lakou are significant and add to its resilience in post-disaster settlements. Informed through the literature and observations of existing Lakou systems in Haiti, I discovered three primary typologies of the Lakou within self-built post-disaster settlements. These typologies are the clustering of houses sharing communal land, whether the land is rented or illegally occupied. The Lakou is a single house occupied by a single nuclear family, the typical form. And lastly, the consideration of an entire camp to be considered a Lakou by its inhabitants. The last typology is a new typology and is comparable to the larger Lakous, traditional Lakous in Haiti, which consist of 100 or more families living within them. So in Kapiti, most everyone living in the post-disaster settlement rents a plot of land. So this area was subdivided and each plot was rented to individuals, as we see here. And these plots had no barriers. The barriers were not including roads. So, neighbors had to come to agreements in order to create the paths and roads to get between the housing. So this first example illustrates an extended family that has built two homes within a fenced perimeter. As you will see, the yard is where the life takes place. In this next case, the property has rented it out to two different families. These families are unrelated, yet they live together on this plot of land in harmony. When asked if they live as family, they reply yes, and even state it as though they are of one Lakou. One of the men living here states, as for surviving, we survive together. The solidarity revealed in this Lakou demonstrates the strength of the social construct of the Lakou. Furthermore, land ownership appears to no longer matter for the Lakou to form. So here we have Save the Children in Port-au-Prince. In Save the Children, the social characteristics of the Lakou were observable in the clustering of houses that I studied, which were located around a courtyard. As I interviewed individuals, I uncovered the importance of surviving in solidarity and sharing with each other. One important aspect of sharing was providing food for those who had none. This is a significant action that traditionally occurs between family members only. So here we begin to see the clustering of houses forming these social processes within the built environment where people use these spaces for active use. So here we also see that size of the spaces is not a significant correlation to the activity that takes place in the space. So here, one of the more active social hubs that I found in this settlement, just off the road, a constant incoming of people chatting and talking with each other, spreading gossip and news. and also a space for children to play. This larger courtyard is predominantly dominated of social activities in the shaded areas, and this large space also turns into the soccer field for the children. So in Sugar Canyon, back in Lakou, is an interesting example. Most of those I interviewed considered themselves to all be living in the Lakou together. The entire camp represented a Lakou to the inhabitants. The leader of the camp stated, "The way you see us here is how we are living. This place is like a village the way you see it, and yes, it is a Lakou. This is where we play and do everything." Another woman remarked, "We live here as one child does, coming from the belly of one mother." Quite an awesome quote. So again here, we start to see these clustering of homes around a central courtyard, which turns to be the active social space for these areas. And here we see another one of the patterns that defines these social hubs within these Lakous, within the greater Lakou, which is the shaded areas created by these open air covered spaces. And then here we even see the agricultural production that takes place within some of these settlements, as well as the entrepreneurs that are creating businesses in their homes in one case, so home-based enterprise, and then others just creating vendors. And these become social hubs and activate the spaces. The wall settlement is another example of an entire camp resembling a Lakou. Living within shared walls, these families acted as one Lakou and did most social activities together, acting as family. The wall settlement represents the typology as the entire camp can be considered one Lakou. Another interesting pattern that develops in the camps is the creation of social hubs. So as I explained earlier with the vendors, these act as important points to relax, gossip, take part in games, and other social activities. As the Lakou moves into post-disaster settlements, the formation's resemblance to the traditional Lakou begins to overlap the key descriptions of the traditional Lakou. The social construct transforms from the kinship model to an inclusive model, consisting of unrelated individuals, as in the case of Lakous and Kapiti. The communal aspect of the transformed Lakou's spatial construct overlaps with the communal aspect of the traditional Lakou. Because there is typically no land ownership in a post-disaster settlement, people do not feel the right to establish physical barriers. Communities cluster their housing in a post-disaster settlement and share the land with each other, the physical manifestation of the social processes. Because there are no barriers between each other, the inhabitants begin to perceive themselves as living together as family, such as the case of Sugar Canyon. Even in post-disaster settlements, where physical divisions are created, it is common for multiple families to live within a fence or other form of barrier. This most often occurs from either the economy of sharing a single dwelling or rent systems are established. For example, a family may decide to build a fence around their houses in a post-disaster settlement, regardless of ownership, and if they move away, they'll rent each individual house into a separate family. Such was the case with the two unrelated families living in Kapiti and Lakou. In the post-disaster camps, sharing becomes a very important aspect, which begins to resemble the communal nature of the traditional Lakou, especially the sharing of meals. When a community perceives they are under one roof, their actions become more uniformed as a family. How does this help inform post-disaster reconstruction? The Lakou helps develop resilience within these communities. The Lakous in post-disaster settlements provide sustenance, security, and support systems. These put together demonstrate the role of the Lakou in post-disaster resilience. Sustenance includes sharing food with each other, as well as the actual agricultural production within these Lakous. Security is provided through the watchful eye of neighbors, having someone to lean on when in economic crisis, and through social solidarity. Furthermore, emotional, financial, and social support systems are apparent, such as childcare, having members of the Lakou to pass time with, play games, and forget about the stress. Having a friend to borrow money from is also an added plus. Lastly, these systems provide flexibility for an individual, such as a saleswoman, to leave her child at home under the watchful eye of a neighbor as she goes out and make a living. So here are some quotes from the interviews with inhabitants in these different settlements. So the implementation of endogenous systems such as vernacular architecture and traditional settlements in a community helps to maintain cultural and social cohesion and creates resilience. Endogenous systems should be taken advantage of in post-disaster redevelopment to create culturally and socially adapted settlements. Happening from the ground up, these bottom-up mechanisms may help improve the development of the community. The social activities formed and bonded within the Lakou demonstrate the beauty of human processes amidst the chaos of disaster recovery. A discussion within post-disaster planning. Here is what has been happening, and my suggestion how the Lakou provides a lens at looking at bottom-up solutions to problems. I conjecture that the declaration of shelter as a human right is one part of the systemic issues with humanitarian aid. I believe that the other part of the triangle, health and sustenance, are universally accepted. But shelter does not fit a universal mold. Within the context of developing nations, we need to be careful with the implementation of humanitarian aid, especially in contexts where strong and or trusted governments does not exist. Top-down systems often act as a buffer zone for aid to be disseminated and appropriated properly within a country. But when these top-down systems and governments are corrupt, aid is never allocated properly. In a way, we need to begin to think counterintuitively within post-disaster policy. I see two problems that currently exist within the field that are not allowing endogenous mechanisms to take place and work alongside with the aid organizations to strengthen resilience. As the nation rebuilds, the Lakou will provide a tie to the roots of the nation and add to the resilience of the country. So looking back at the implications of shelter as a human right, one part of the post-disaster housing problem is how we define shelter and housing. In shelter projects, too much focus is placed on building shelters with a roof, walls, windows, and a door, often expending most of the aid in early temporary shelter construction. In combination with this, architects and designers working with NGOs look too much to innovation and do not establish relationships with the embedded expertise within the local community. In a way, we come up with an idea of what should be done without asking the community what they want done. A perfect example is the implementation of composting toilets in Haiti, many of which were turned into kitchens because of the value of the resources used to build that structure. We need to stop designing and planning in our ivory towers and get dirty in the thick of it. The other problem, which coincides with the first, revolves around the business operations of humanitarian aid organizations. More often than not, humanitarian aid and architecture as activism is marketed toward the masses, creating a perpetuating cycle of self-gratification. You may ask why. It is because it makes fiscal sense, bringing in the flows of funding and appeasing stakeholders. But do these projects do what they claim to do? Yes, thousands are housed, but thousands more are left unhoused, and this creates massive tensions between members within the same community. Too often, humanitarian aid and architecture end in good intentions gone wrong. With one last remark to consider, how do we disseminate aid to the 99% that needs the aid, losing a significant proportion before it ever reaches them? Should we limit the amount of time foreign volunteers are allowed to work in the reconstruction process? Can we allow for endogenous systems to have time to develop and form organic processes? And do we project negative connotations to systems that work because of their inefficiencies? I want to thank you for taking your time to watch this lecture and have a great day.